Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name's Jen Goldsack, and I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this exceptional discussion we have planned for you today. Before we go ahead and get started, I'm going to do a couple of things. First of all, for those of you who might not be familiar with the Digital Medicine Society, I'll go ahead and introduce our organization. And then inevitably, before we get into the fun stuff, I'll run through some housekeeping just so you all feel welcome and you know how you can engage with our panel of experts today. So the Digital Medicine Society, in case you're not familiar with us, we are a global nonprofit. Our mission is to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital technologies to redefine healthcare and improve lives. We do that through research, we do that through education, and we do that through tracking and benchmarking the application of best practices that improve lives. And I think the improve lives piece is really important. When we think about success, despite being technical enthusiasts here at the Digital Medicine Society, we are not tech determinists. Our goal here is not to shoehorn technology into every nook and cranny of healthcare delivery, public health, medical product development, and call it success, but rather it's really to think about how can we use the digitization of healthcare to address some of the most pressing and persistent challenges that we face. And in this environment and in this highly regulated industry, we have to think about embracing regulations as an enabler to that process. And that's going to be what we dive into, again, with this exceptional panel of experts we have here today. Before I go ahead and call on my colleagues to introduce themselves, let's do that housekeeping that I threatened. And by the way, I promise this is a discussion and not death by PowerPoint. We're just going to run through a few things here. So first of all, full disclosure, today's session is going to be recorded. That's good news. After you enjoy the conversation today, it will be available for you on the DIME website to share with your colleagues for further discussion. We will also leave plenty of time for discussion at the end of the panel. There's a couple of ways you can get engaged. You can go ahead and raise your hand, not like this, but you can use the reaction bar in the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you aren't somewhere that you can chat, you can certainly drop comments or questions into the chat as we go, and we will get to those at the end. We'll also be dropping a few links into the chat as we go so that you can stay up to date with some of the case examples and some of the resources that we mentioned. But I'll give you a break from me here for a second, and I'll do as I threatened and introduce not just wonderful leaders of the field and valued colleagues, but friends that I am delighted to be working to advance the field with. And Troy, I'm going to come to you first and ask you to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're working on right now.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here, and I appreciate the invitation to join this wonderful discussion with fantastic other panelists as well. So I'm Troy Tasbaz. I'm the Director for Digital Health Center of Excellence at FDA. About 6 months into the job, I came from the industry, joining FDA as we wanted to really work on some of the cutting edge activities that are happening and how do we enable that. So our focus has been really doing a landscape analysis and trying to envision the future of healthcare delivery. And I use the term healthcare delivery here very, very specifically in a sense that what we're trying to do is make sure that we can enable a future where a person is engaging with their health much earlier than ever becoming a patient. And that's kind of where we believe healthcare is going to. So it's been wonderful to be here, working with fantastic folks at FDA as well as the industry at large. So looking forward to this discussion.
Terrific. Troy, thanks for joining us today. And Marissa, I'm going to come to you and ask you to do your intro next.
Absolutely. It's lovely to be here. I'm Marissa Cruz. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Empatica, which is a digital health company focused on creating digital biomarkers and wearables for clinical monitoring and remote patient monitoring, as well as clinical research. I oversee the regulatory and quality group, as well as our data science group at Empatica. And I'm a practicing clinician and have spent a number of years at FDA working on some digital health policy prior to Troy joining the agency. It's lovely to meet you, and I'm excited to continue to foster close collaboration between organizations like mine and the agency.
Marissa, thank you so much. Thank you for all of your partnership over the years here at Dime and all of your leadership in the field. And Arash, balancing out the accents and making it hard for anyone who's listening in, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Jen, and really excited to be on this panel. My name is Arash. I'm the Global Clinical Director of Humour, which is a global digital health company headquartered in London, and we support remote care and remote clinical trials. By background, I'm an academic paediatrician, mostly based at Imperial College London, and my role at Humour is to lead the evidence generation that we do across not just our commercial activities, but also supporting our regulatory submissions. And two recent achievements we're particularly proud of at Humour are certifications for our condition agnostic platform. And so that's a Class 2 certification with the FDA, and also Class 2B certification in the EU. So for us, regulation is a huge part of what we do, particularly with that ambition of being a global footprint. And so I'm really excited to share thoughts and exchange ideas on this panel.
Fantastic. Arash, delighted to have you here. And I think there's an awful lot of very practical experience, both from industry and in regulatory pathways here on the call today. So I anticipate a terrific conversation. And Troy, I'm actually going to start by pulling on a thread that you sort of laid down for us during your introduction there, which is this notion of, what is it that we're doing here? And you sort of briefly described this vision of, can we actually think about healthcare manifesting in a very different way? And, obviously I'm sort of paraphrasing here. Can we think about what sometimes we describe at Dime as, good healthcare actually being good healthcare, where, it's measured by, can we keep people out of the clinic and can we keep them healthy, as opposed to the sick care system that we have on both sides of the pond, where we sit in the clinic and we wait for people to arrive and then we sort of evaluate the patch-up job we're able to do. It's a bold vision. It's an exciting vision. It's the vision we need to make healthcare sustainable and equitable and affordable. What role does regulation play in this?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, what role does regulation? Let me answer it maybe this way. Maybe it's not what role regulation plays into it, but how you use regulation to hopefully drive investments into the right areas where you can actually see an outcome based on public health improvements, right? So I look at regulation, and I always joke about this. I have no medical background, I don't have regulatory affairs background, and I don't have policy background, so I'm perfect for this job, if you think about it, right? So, but where regulation, or at least the federal government, plays into it, if you look at this thing from a purely a numbers perspective, there are roughly around 150 million people covered by either CMS, so Medicare, Medicaid, but also any kind of subsidization on local exchanges. That's a lot of information that we have on what's going on in public health, where we're spending money, where are the trends that we should be, in my opinion, and that's why I came to the federal government, we should be providing that and sharing that information, because you can actually drive then investments into specific areas where, one, it's a very large addressable market, which is most of the people on this call are going to care about. I mean, it is a business nonetheless, right? And we have public health improvements that could potentially come out of it. And then, of course, regulation is to enable that with safety and effectivity in mind. And I always remind people that FDA's principles are, we have to enable public health improvements through safe and effective medical products that are coming into the market. That's our goal. So that's where regulation really comes in. It's not, I wouldn't look at it as a blocker, but maybe sometimes it's more of it's bringing focus to where things should be going to.
I really like this. I really like this notion that very intentional, very thoughtful regulatory strategy. And in particular, Troy, one of the things that I've so enjoyed sort of witnessing during your tenure at FDA is to work very collaboratively with industry on, look, where can regulator or regulations be that greatest facilitator? How can that unlock some of the challenges, whether that's around timelines, whether it's around certainty, clarity, investment that needs to go into these things, and actually having that as a dialogue between, our regulatory colleagues and industry in order to really encourage the highest value products being the ones that come first to market.
Right. Yeah, and also I would say using regulation part of your strategic roadmap development. So I always tell the story. The first time I ever dealt with it as a blocker, I used to do data center investments and product placements in all over the world for a very large corporation. And when I was building a data center in a Middle Eastern country, it got stuck because they had passed a law that required us to do emissions testing. And why that was really important is because we end up not being able to satisfy our customer contracts because it took us 2 months to clear customs to even do that. So that experience alone taught me a big lesson around trying to understand the regulations well ahead of before you even plan to apply for them, before you have to certify your product. So what I end up doing after that is, okay, if I'm going to be placing a data center with specific products, because we were also targeting a lot of highly regulated industries beyond healthcare, then I had to really truly understand the regulation and not viewed as a blocker, but almost to be as a competitive advantage because I'm getting in front of that. That means that I am going to be able to generate revenue much quicker if I bake this into my roadmap well before I'm ready to apply for it. So I encourage people since I've joined that you really truly have to understand when do you need to start applying for something, right? When do you have to come in through FDA regulatory approvals, but then of course understand other regulations that you might be adhering to or even payer coverage. So what I did this in my product development experience, and I've developed healthcare products as well, is that we started baking those timelines and milestones into our product development at the onset of it, not at the end of, hey, we're ready to deploy a product and start generating revenue, but we haven't actually certified the product, so we can't really offer it to the market. So I highly encourage everyone who is either a developer or an entrepreneur to start thinking about that at the onset. Don't look at it as a blocker, look at it as an enabler.
Troy, I love that. And riffing off what you just said, not only an enabler, but a differentiator. And what's a tough market right now? And in a market where we really need the cream to rise and for those terrific solutions to come to the fore. It's fascinating hearing your experience from industry and then bringing it into the agency. Marissa, you went from being within FDA and CDRH in particular to then going on and taking a leadership role within industry. Can you give us some thoughts on where are we in terms of mindset and sort of this embrace of regulatory strategy as a core component of good business strategy and commercial success?
Yeah, absolutely. I think people approach regulation with different mindsets, certainly. And I do think being very clear upfront, as Troy said, about the regulatory requirements and really where you want to position your product, I think is very important, right? I think that there are still, I think, in the industry, a number of companies who are less familiar with regulatory requirements, with the regulatory process, and do, there's a bit of an avoidance mindset of trying to make sure that you fall on the line of not being a medical product, not being a regulated medical device. However, I do think, as by virtue of these kinds of conversations and the work that DIME is doing and others in the field, I do think there's we're starting to see a shift of increasing familiarity, increasing acceptance, and of embrace of this idea of competitive advantage, of competitive differentiation. And I think people are increasingly seeing their clients asking for that level of independent review, of verification that products are truly safe and effective, and that there is evidence to support performance standards, right? So I do think that while there lingers some inertia around embracing a regulatory mindset and embracing regulatory requirements, I do think from a couple of different perspectives, there is increasing push towards, people who are making products that do have potential medical device functions to embrace that and to be able to supply the evidence behind it in the face of customer demands and a rising awareness that this is just what the field requires.
Marissa, I think that's exactly right. And you have talked about some of the work that's been done. And I actually did a little bit of homework before jumping on today. And Troy, I was looking, I think there's 24 final or draft guidance documents that now relate to the oversight of digital medical products, which is really quite a mature regulatory landscape. And it's not only the existence of those guidance documents, that clarity, which leads to things like the ability to be able to do that long-term planning, to have business certainty, all of which grease the skids as we pursue not only fantastic impact on health outcomes, but also our, commercial success, which is needed to drive our whole industry. But Marissa, you talked about some of the other bodies of work that have sort of supported this. So we can think about the FDA's Digital Health Policy Navigator. We can think about the work that we collaborated on, the US Regulatory Pathways Decision Tool. We can think about the education work that was just released today by our Digital Medicine Academy, really giving people the skills and trying to support some of that change management around embracing regulatory strategy. And Arash, during your opening remarks, you gave two examples of, really quite outsized success you've had recently that have, one, I think, proven what a differentiator a great regulatory strategy can have. I'd love to get your thoughts on that to start with, and then I've got a few follow-ups on that if I can.
Sure thing. And I think the points that have been made already on this stem from, I think, a fundamental view that if done right, regulation is a good thing, not just for quality and safety, but actually I would also argue, if done well, regulation can actually in a way save time. So clear regulation that you give guidance to industry about what's required, what's the evidence, can actually be a really useful tool to be able to think about what evidence you need to do, the types of studies you need to generate, the kind of evidence and rigor you need to adopt. And that can save a lot of time for researchers and for industry. And one thing that we found very useful is actually using the guidance documents across the various jurisdictions that we submitted to. That's been incredibly helpful, not just to plan the submission, but actually going further back. And this is to Troy's point about planning these things in advance, to actually think about what do we need some of these studies to be able to do and demonstrate later down the line in order to be able to get this in really broad intended use that we wanted, and to plan that in advance, and that takes time. I think the second thing it does is actually it engenders trust, and in a way that can actually save significant amounts of time when it comes to the commercialization of this. I think for all the times that regulation can be criticized, I don't think we would necessarily want to navigate a landscape where every single possible conversation between industry partners or industry partners and clients doesn't come from a position of trust. And that comes from having the certification, that comes from the regulation. So I think when done rightly, that can also save a huge amount of time. And I think the final way in this can save a lot of time is actually it can help guide us as to what is it that we need to do to fill the gaps of the current evidence base. Actually, what is it that we need to do to continue to improve and iterate these products? Particularly in software, we have a real advantage of getting solutions, whether they're medical devices, digital therapeutics, but essentially solutions that can be iterated much faster than any traditional pharmaceutical can. That's a great opportunity, but I think we need to do it from a position of responsibility, and that requires good regulation to engender the trust amongst not just patients, but clinicians. So with all that in mind, I think that's kind of the approach that we took quite early on. It was to recognize that these things are there for good reason, that if a bar is particularly high, what it means is that the rewards at the other side are particularly rewarding. And actually to go through that process and to go through that process honestly and have a meaningful conversation with regulators when you are introducing something that's relatively new, whether it's a new program or whether it's a relatively new device.
Can I build on
Please.
what Arash said? Because I think he's making a really good point in some of the paradigm shift that we're seeing within particularly emerging technologies. Like everybody talks about artificial intelligence, but you have to really break down artificial intelligence into more like predictive kind of AI models versus generative. And why it's really important that you have to start actually being a little more targeted and almost to be bespoke in the way that you think about it is because what Arash said, that it's not about the regulatory approval using a clinical evidence to get the approval itself, but it's the post-market surveillance and understanding how that product is going to perform after it's deployed. That's actually the bigger risk. It's not the getting the approval. It's about once you deploy it, do you have the guardrails in place to understand what that product performance, that algorithmic performance is doing based on new data that it's actually ingesting and learning from? And there's obviously regulation that has to think about this thing, but I think as an industry, I'm going to keep saying this, safe and effectiveness. I mean, as an industry, we do have to agree that we're going after not just highly regulated, but highly impactful areas of medical practice, and these are people's lives at stake. So we have to think of it in terms of that this is not a consumer product most of the time. And so I do want to really emphasize the need to understand that regulation will help with guide through a lot of this stuff, but we also have to think in terms of our product performance and making sure that we could answer the same questions a year later that we were able to answer when you were going through your regulatory approval process.
What I really like about this conversation is it's this idea that actually the fundamentals haven't changed. It's about this idea of being safe and effective. And while we are fortunate enough to be furnished with new sorts of potential digital solutions every day because of the pace of innovation, we still have a responsibility to confirm that they are safe and effective, and sort of dismissing this notion of regulatory as a barrier and thinking about it as a way to build trust or even as a differentiator. Arash, this gets back to something you and I talk about all the time, which is we shouldn't be arguing over lowering the bar to make it easier. We should be embracing the fact that safe and effective are tenets of healthcare. And if we want to actually change the way we care for people and improve health outcomes, we have to get to that point. Arash, I don't know if you want to sort of pile on there, because I know it's a conversation you and I have had often.
And maybe an analogy that's helpful is if we think about what we want, because really this is some of these conversations are around what do we want regulations for medical devices, digital therapeutics, what do we want it to look like? And the analogy that I think of is what would we want regulations for our clinicians, the people who are there actually looking after us, to look like? I don't think anyone would want those regulations, those bars to be lowered. We wouldn't want the standards to ever be watered down. So whenever we talk about reform or changes, I don't think anyone would want that. But what we might potentially want is to improve and make it streamlined the way we train, develop, educate clinicians. And so I think when we talk about how can we change regulation in this industry to make sure that we get a range of up-to-date new novel products in a safe and effective way, I don't think the answer can be to lower the standards. The answer has to be around actually, how do we communicate these? How do we potentially harmonize these regulations? How do we potentially share best practice to enable success that's happened in one part of the industry to be shared elsewhere? There is great scope, but I don't think anyone would, and I certainly wouldn't as a clinician myself, ever want to advocate for the bar to be lowered, because to my earlier point, I really think we take for granted what that trust does and how our industry benefits from that trust, and how we're able to do so many of the things that we take for granted because we're assured that the certifications mean something, that the standards mean something, that the level of evidence is credible. And I think to Troy's point earlier, I think there are absolutely two different elements to this. One is going to be the evidence that we generate, any product generates, to demonstrate its efficacy, its safety, its effectiveness. But a huge part of this also has to be around what are the processes and steps in place within the organization that is actually delivering that product to give assurance that it can deliver on things like its post-market surveillance, that it's got the ability to understand and appraise and integrate the evidence, that it is, scientifically driven, clinically led. That I say is equally important. And I would totally echo his earlier comment.
And it's interesting to think, right, that this notion of doing these steps just in time is not going to serve us well. So it's not just regulations, it's regulatory strategy. It's regulatory strategy that drives your whole business strategy, your commercialization strategy, your investment strategy, all of these different pieces. It's absolutely fundamental to begin with the end in mind, and even recognizing those post-market commitments is absolutely critical. Marissa, you've been doing this in industry for a while now. And one of the things I like about Empatica is that you were one of the first to really say, look, yes, we are using AI, and yes, we do know what we're doing. So while, as Troy said, you know, AI is not AI, and is not machine learning, but that's a whole other conversation. Tell us a little bit about how you've been sort of planning with the end in mind, and how that's actually, how you've got some reps on that sort of strategic planning process.
Absolutely. You know, I think AI is, you know, it's quite buzzy now, but it is a field that's been around for a while, right? And I think that there have been emerging best practices, both in industry and as frameworks that have been set out by FDA. And so I think that's helping considerably to harmonize verbiage, to harmonize strategy, to harmonize standards for effectiveness in this field, right? When you apply AI to medical devices, there are additional complexities involved in planning a clinical trial and planning things like post-market surveillance and ensuring that the algorithm continues to perform on as broad a population as it's intended to be used for. And so, you know, I think that Empatica has done an excellent job over the years of engaging frequently with the agency to explain where AI is part of the algorithm development process, where we are taking considerations relevant to AI into the design of clinical trials, and how we're explaining ongoing performance requirements once the product has been introduced into a market. So, you know, I do think that there's opportunities for continued clarity from a regulatory standpoint on specifically, you know, some of the newer constructs like pre-specified change protocols. You know, I think there's been early effort to define those. I think not a lot of companies to date have been taken that all the way through the regulatory process. And so I think we'll all benefit from being able to learn from that process as people go through defining what are the boundaries of a protocol that are considered to be acceptable to the agency. But I think there's great benefit in engaging early to bring planned advances in AI to the regulatory body's attention, so that there can be, you know, fulsome discussions about what will be expected now and what we can expect for evolutions in regulatory paradigms in the future.
Fantastic. I think you're exactly right. We are all looking, I think, at folks who are the leading edge, especially the leading edge of embracing some of the most recent guidance documents. And, you know, Troy, one of the things that we've enjoyed working with you on is, you know, trying to benchmark industry needs for increased regulatory clarity, just like Marissa mentioned. And also, what are some of the very tactical things that can be done in terms of sharing case examples, so on and so forth, to really position our leading innovators who have, you know, the will and the capabilities to drive towards these terrific solutions, and to be able to get them over the line and to do it in a way that is, just like you said, safe and effective. The third rail, if you like, to all of this is the pace of change. And on the one hand, the pace of change is exciting because we have pressing and persistent challenges in healthcare that we've never been able to address. And hopefully these new tools in the toolbox can get us there. But how do you think about positioning your team in order to keep pace with the rate of innovation that's happening in industry? The first thing you've done is you've asked, and we will have the results of that benchmarking study in just a few weeks. But what else is, tactically, what else are you doing to keep pace?
Well, the first is trying to understand where the industry is thinking about going. It's you know, one of the first things that I asked the team is like, you know, are we chasing or are we leading, and what is the right, I guess, dynamics that we have to have with the industry itself. And one thing about regulatory strategy, it goes on both sides of the table, right? So we have to think about regulatory strategy, and do we have the appropriate regulations that enable this potential future based on where the industry is going? And then on top of that, you have to also be able to look at, are these regulations, are they applicable to what I'm doing, and is it enabling what I'm doing? So tactically, what we really started kind of talking about is like, we have to think less as a regulatory agency, but more as, almost to a degree, investment bankers who really try to understand where is the capital being spent, because it tells you a lot, right? And so we started thinking very differently around, maybe we need to have more engagement with venture capitalists. Maybe we need to have more engagement directly with entrepreneurs in like early stage entrepreneurs, and because you can tell a lot about that, right? I mean, where they believe things are going. So we are talking to other agencies around trying to get data analysis around where our money is being spent. You know, CMS alone spends about $1.3 trillion a year out of the roughly around $4.3 trillion that right now our total healthcare spend is, which is not a very good number, actually, because it's just the healthcare spend is going up, but life expectancy is coming down in the United States. So tactically, what we've been really investing on is, when we came in, I worked with the team around coming up with three kind of strategic objectives. One was, let's envision what healthcare is going to look like in 2030, because it's long enough, far out, that you can still envision, but close enough that you actually have to do something about it, right? Then the second one was, how do we enable that? And that's through some projects that we're working on, both internal and external projects. Some of those internal ones are more transformative projects, and transformation in this context is really looking at process innovation around, do we have the right process to enable this? And then the last one is expanding. And then expansion has its own kind of tactical execution steps as well. And it could be more around health equity expansion, like how do we actually deliver healthcare outside of the hospital walls that increases access? Or it could be, how do we actually think about regulation and payer together, payer coverage together, and can we improve the process that allows the industry to expand its reach, right? And so we're really thinking about those three objectives, and under those are really tactical programs that we have established in order to drive those. And the VC Connect was just one of them. And then this is a very early, it's in its early stages, but the idea is that we want to be able to tie where dollars are being spent by the payers, as well as just effectively out of pocket patient spending, and where maybe capital should flow. And I don't believe that the government should get into that, where we're dictating, but it's more of a connecting the dots. And then, of course, helping. What that really is it's a go-to-market strategy for many of the investors and entrepreneurs. And that was my background. So it's like, that's the language that I know how to speak to folks around, well, how do we make sure that you understand where the addressable market is? And then it's up to you to decide what you want to do. But that's kind of effectively a tactical execution.
It's really exciting to hear how, you sit where you are in the US, certainly, controlling market access. How do you look upstream to those colleagues and decision makers to make sure that there's the necessary incentives to the extent to which you can provide them to invest in the right things, and you have a deep understanding of that? And then how do you look downstream? And I actually think this is the bit that has been vastly overlooked by industry for years now, which is getting regulatory acceptance does not mean you are going to have a commercial success on your hands, nor does it mean that you're actually going to improve anyone's life. You have to think about all of those downstream decision makers, whether it's a payer, whether it's a prescribing clinician, whether it's a patient themselves. Arash, back to your point about someone who's actually going to trust the product that's being recommended to them. And absent that long-term view, we are not going to be successful. So it's exciting to hear you talk about the strategic positioning of regulatory oversight in this life cycle of a product.
I mean, So I recently read a document. It was a fascinating document, and probably no one has ever said a recently published CMS document was fascinating, but it was fascinating. It was the TSET document that they recently published. And I learned so much about the thinking around how Medicare decisions are being made. And it made sense to me that someone is coming from an FDA perspective, they get the regulatory approval, and they go, well, I need to get Medicare coverage as well. And the question that I would ask is, did you test the product? Did you have anybody in the Medicare population cohort as part of your clinical study? No? Well, why would someone want to cover something that has not been proven on the Medicare cohort? That made a lot of sense to me, right? And that's not in my opinion, a regulatory strategy. That's a market analysis. That's an understanding who your target is going to be. So if I were thinking about this thing from a product, you have to also answer the question, how am I going to get paid for this product? Is it through business to business? Is it business to consumer? Or is it through payer coverage? And you need to answer that question at the very early stages of your product development, not at the very end of it. And we have some unfortunate case studies here that you all are very, very familiar with that recently went bankrupt and these were, from a market capitalization perspective, very, very large digital health providers. So, I kind of encourage people to think like this in the sense that ask the question, what product am I doing? Who am I selling this to? And how am I getting paid? How do I generate revenue through that? What channels do I generate revenue through that? If you can answer that question, then you'll understand what your regulatory strategy should be.
100%. And some of the work that we're actually gearing up to do here at Dime is built around this notion of an integrated evidence plan, which is if we capture the evidence for every single one of these decision makers sequentially, not only does it take an inordinately long period of time, not only is it expensive, there's an argument that it's actually unethical to go back and replicate very similar studies, just suddenly realizing what the outcomes and endpoints you need to show are to these different decision makers. I think there's an awful lot of efficiency that can still be gained by taking this integrated approach to evidence generation. And Troy, it's exciting to see you sort of championing that on the government side. And Arash, I want to come back to you because I think one of the ways I might try and summarize what Troy's been describing is this idea of actually, taking market signals and actually building products that are solutions. 6 months ago, you couldn't read anything in the, gray literature that wasn't sort of railing on point solutions. And one of the things that Hume has done, the two examples you gave, were these platform solutions. So first of all, can you describe for everyone on the line who might not know what a platform solution is, what that kind of product is, and then talk about how your product strategy and then in turn your regulatory strategy was informed by market signals and by regulatory pathways.
Sure thing, Jen. So firstly, the platform that we have certified both with the FDA and also with EU MDR, hopefully soon as well, MDSAP, is essentially a condition agnostic platform. So the idea is to move away from offer an alternative to just products that are catered or tailored for specific populations, but also start to think about when we're providing solutions for individuals who have more than one condition, but also if you're providing digital health solutions for other organizations who have a whole spectrum of patients and therapeutic conditions they look after, how can you provide a solution that enables all those needs to be catered for? So that is with that sort of value proposition in mind, that's how we based our regulatory strategy and our approach. And a lot of work went into that over a number of years. So the first regulator that we went through that process for was in the EU, and for that piece of work, we ended up synthesizing findings from almost 20 different studies, deployments, pieces of research that we had done with collaborations from across the industry. So the process itself took over a year, but actually the work that went into it was something that we'd been planning for a long time, because it does take time to kind of develop those studies to develop those protocols to put that work into place. I think the opportunity that now means is that we now have a product that when we are speaking to partners, whether they're in the life science space or whether they are in the healthcare space, that actually the conversations we're now able to have are not just limited to one therapeutic area, they are enterprise-wide conversations that we're able to have. And yes, we'll usually start in one therapeutic area almost as a proof of concept, but it's always something where we extend to different areas, different therapeutic areas, different patient populations. That's facilitated. That, yes, did take quite a while. But the other thing I would say, and this is kind of a comment about regulations themselves and are they adapting? It's a relatively novel concept, and yet our experience of it in so far for 2 regulators is that itself wasn't necessarily an obstacle to getting the certification. So in the EU MDR process, we went through that regular process with the FDA. We went through the E-Star program, just because we were using something that's a little bit different, a little bit kind of paradigm shifting. That wasn't an obstacle to it. And my view is that shows that actually, if you go back to basic principles of how we should do regulation, look at the evidence, look at that quality management system, look at kind of also like the expertise that's there within the organization, kind of the processes and governance there. I think we're in a pretty strong place to look at other technologies and some of the challenges, for example, that Marissa highlighted around how do we start to think about future technologies, whether it's AI, whether it's other machine learning tools. I think that's something that we can apply those same principles to. And on our end, we've tried to future-proof ourselves to that. So our intended use also allows us to incorporate new novel algorithms. And so a huge part of the work that we had to do was to demonstrate the work that we'd done in developing some of these machine learning tools, and again, go through that process. And our experience was that wasn't a barrier amongst the regulators, because again, when you go back to basic principles, there's always a way to get assurance and find out what's the right thing to do. How do we prove not only this is good enough now, but the processes are in place that actually this is going to be assured going ahead.
I love this topic, and I wonder if I can pile on for a moment. So Empatica also makes a full stack platform with biomarkers specific to various disease states, but in the service of, as you were saying, Arash, of being able to address a full patient solution, right? Acknowledging that patients have multiple comorbidities, that there's a need to be able to span clinical domains when you're devising a medical device solution for certain types of patients and certain types of clinical trials, for example. I do think that this is an example of where there's an opportunity for the digital health group at FDA to help to provide additional clarity to folks who are interested in engaging with the agency in not particular sort of OHT specific medical devices, right? When we start to devise platforms, we start to devise more clinical domain agnostic solutions for certain types of medical devices. I think there's an opportunity to provide some additional guidance on how to navigate the agency and how best to be able to leverage champions in the digital health group to ensure that there's clarity among individual review teams and across the center as a whole as to how these kinds of devices should be understood, what are the standards for performance, et cetera. So I think this is a really exciting shift, as you said, Jen, away from kind of point solutions to more comprehensive and global thoughtful product development that spans multiple clinical domains. And I think that's an area where additional collaboration between industry and FDA will be really illuminating.
And Marissa, we're listening to these types of feedback. So yeah, there's a lot of, we're looking into kind of how do we do process innovation to essentially engage with the community much more closer than the transactional engagement model that we have.
Yeah, and I think that's very exciting to see that kind of leadership from the agency and willingness to sort of engage in non-traditional ways.
Fantastic. And I will just give a little bit of a plug. And in fact, everyone on the line here among the presenter community was involved in this. I reference this industry needs assessment, a series of workshops and a sort of very broad benchmarking survey. Those results we will be sharing, Troy, with your team, so our FDA colleagues within the next week or so, similarly with participants, and we plan to release all of those data very publicly so that we can all put eyes on, hey, what are the leaders in this field thinking? What do we need? What are the opportunities? And to really embrace that transparency. So stay tuned for that. And actually, colleagues on the line, first of all, I'm going to warn everyone in the audience that we're going to open it up for questions soon. So if you do have anything you want to pose to this really extraordinary panel of experts, please start dropping those into the chat or start raising your hand, and I'll keep an eye on that. I do also want to just share my screen for a second here and introduce a new resource that we launched today here at DIME. So at DIME, we are proud to, in addition to our pre-competitive evidence generation, we have a really terrific series of educational courses within our Digital Medicine Academy. And today we launched Unlocking Regulatory Success for Digital Health Product Developers. And with no prompting from me whatsoever, the three of you did a terrific wind up for why this is so important. There is a regulatory landscape today that is mature. Embracing digital strategy is a differentiator for you as an expert working in the field, for your products and product portfolio, and for your organization. We can't forget either the patients that we're all here to serve. And when we embrace regulatory strategy, we do build more trusted products. We can speed them to market to the patients who need them much more quickly. And one of the things that I love about this course is how practical it is, the number of case examples that are in there, and it touches on all of the points that you've mentioned today. It clarifies the different regulatory pathways. It thinks about the evidence that you need to develop, and it sort of coaches you on how to develop that. It helps you build a fit-for-purpose regulatory strategy that is not just good for today, but will help your product and product portfolio endure and be successful over time, and make sure that then there are no sort of downstream surprises in terms of you maintaining the success of your regulated products once they're on the market. So good news for everyone who's on the line today, for joining us today. This is where I get to feel like Oprah for like 30 seconds. We are going to be sending you all free access to the course for joining us. We're incredibly proud of this. It went live just this morning, and we'll make sure that every single one of you gets a link and follow up. And probably with that, I've done enough mumbling to, one, hopefully get people really excited about what we have to share, but also hopefully some questions here in the chat. Let me take a look and check for hands as well. And I pretend I was a good multitasker, but I'm not. Let's see. I've done a really tremendous, here we go. Oh no, just some chatter. I don't see any direct questions here. Well, maybe I will leave it with you all then to give last words, because this is really important. When we think about the combined experience and success that you have had, each one of you in industry, and then the exposure that you've had either from inside the agency or from industry to some of the most innovative digital pathways or digital regulatory pathways that we have, if you had to give everyone on the line, product developers who really are working hard, who are bringing sort of the full power of innovation to the table to improve the lives of patients, what would be the one recommendation that you would make to folks as they continue to sort of forge ahead in the field, as they continue to build digital products to improve lives? And Marissa, I'm going to start with you.
One word of advice. I think that I would probably emphasize, and this sort of is an echo of a lot of this conversation, the need for advanced planning, not only from like a business and a regulatory standpoint, but also from a patient need standpoint. And so making patient need, patient-centric design sort of the foremost goal in devising these medical solutions. Innovation is beneficial only to patients if they're truly addressing a clinical need and they're meeting people where they are. Products need to be not only safe and effective, that is a fundamental bar, but also usable and intuitive and meaningful to the people who will actually use them. So I would emphasize Arash's point earlier about, clinically led and patient-centric design being foundational to product development.
Marissa, I'm so happy that you reminded us of that North Star. I think it's exciting to think about the technology that we have at our fingertips, and we have to remind ourselves of what we're here to do. So I love that, and thank you. Arash, let me come to you next.
So I guess mine is similar, but slightly overlapping. I think firstly, it's about trusting the process and remembering where you're trying to get to. And in my mind, that's remembering we are in a scientific medical industry, and it never hurts to have that expertise as close to the product development process as possible. Our big reflection was that having an in-house clinical team, often with clinicians who are still practicing, clinicians of academic roles, was incredibly helpful throughout this journey. And then as we start to transition into thinking about the embedding of these new technologies, including AI, to actually have that in-house expertise, having, an AI department, machine learning engineers. So I think bringing in those conversations, those voices to the table earlier on in that process is really key. And I think that stems into the second piece of advice, which I think Troy mentioned right at the very beginning, which is about planning. I think these things take time to put into place. It's not as long as planning, say, drug approvals, but it's still long, and it should be long, because these things take time to get right. These things often take time before the outcomes of interest we need are going to manifest. But also, not everyone's going to get it right the first time, and there's a lot of trying, there's a lot of improving, there's a lot of iterating. And so making sure there's a process in place that can learn from the good and the bad is going to be really important to start you off on that journey to eventually getting whatever certification or whatever regulatory bar that you're trying to get over.
Arash, two terrific pieces of advice. Thank you. And Troy, I'll turn it over to you for the final piece of advice for everyone on the line today.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add anything else, because both Marissa and Arash covered it. I would say just truly understanding your ecosystem, and the ecosystem is your a few of them, right? Patients, it's your regulatory, it's your payers, it's your physicians or medical professionals. Truly understanding your ecosystem, and what both Arash and Marissa covered are if you don't understand the ecosystem, you're not going to understand how the users are going to engage with the product. And that's a big problem right now that I've seen, even being in Silicon Valley, where this concept of UX is not how pretty the app is. It's about how the users are interacting with that, and how that process, how they're integrating with the process. But really, technology should be integrating into the medical care process, not the other way around. And that's what you have to also start thinking about. So what I of all the advices that I could give is that make sure that you know what the product in healthcare delivery is. It's the physician and the patient and the service between them. That's the product. So what you have to do is integrate it into that process, and you have to make that process better. That would be the probably advice.
I love this. I love this notion of a deep understanding of what the product actually is in our highly complex environment. And then a reminder, Marissa, looping back to what you said, what's the value here? And the value is we have the opportunity to improve people's lives. The kind of revolution that healthcare could potentially go through over the next few years, and in fact is already going through, is probably a once in a lifetime, once in a career moment. And we have the opportunity to really address some of those issues that we've been unable to solve so far. So it's exciting, it's inspiring. And it is a privilege to work alongside the three of you in this industry. There is much to do. And before I thank you properly, I'm going to share just a couple more things for folks on the line to be able to continue to get engaged in this process with us. So again, please do go ahead, access that education course. Congratulations to the DIME education team. It's absolutely exceptional content. Thank you to all of our faculty members, and I hope you all enjoy this course. We also have some pre-competitive work coming up. And again, folks on the line, we will be partnering on this again to really think about these integrated evidence plans, to really think about the broader ecosystem. And there's work coming down the pike that will be addressing that. And if you want to get engaged with us, please do let us know. But finally, Troy, Marissa, Arash, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today. Time is very precious, especially for you guys. Thank you for everyone on the line for joining us. And just we have a lot of work to do, but there's incredible amount of opportunity. So here's to harnessing all of the regulatory strategies that we can in order to keep forging ahead.